Did you collect anything when you were a kid? When I was a kid, I had a polished rock collection. So every time my family would go on a vacation, if we had an opportunity to visit the gift shop or like the little souvenir stand outside, I would always choose those little bags of polished rocks as like my souvenir if we were allowed to do that. And then I would bring them home, and over time I developed quite a collection of all sorts of different polished rocks. And sometimes I would kind of like line them up according to color. And other times I would just kind of hold them and like feel how smooth they were. And over time, as I began to add to my collection, what I really wanted was my own rock tumbler. Now, I was also kind of crafty as a kid, so this idea of like making my own polished rocks with a rock tumbler really appealed to me. And a rock tumbler is like this little machine. It's almost like a barrel on an axle, and you use it to make your own polished rocks. You put a bunch of rocks in there, and then at different points in the process, you put in some solution or some chemicals, and they come out all like smooth and glossy and nice. Now, I was thinking back, and I even asked my mom, and neither of us can remember whether or not I actually got what I was hoping for, whether I ever got my rock tumbler or not. But what I mostly remember about that period of my childhood was that I really wanted this rock tumbler, and my parents really didn't want me to have one. Now, when I was a kid, I didn't understand why my parents would say no to something like this. But now that I am a parent, I completely get why they would say no. Rock tumblers are really, really loud. And they're loud because of how they work. This is how rock tumblers work. You take a whole bunch of rocks and you put them in like the barrel part of the rock tumbler, and then as the barrel turns, like you just keep on banging them against each other over and over and over a long period of time. Have you ever found like a super smooth rock on a beach or something? Well, this is how that rock got so smooth. Water and sand and other rocks over a long period of time have washed over it and kind of rubbed off all the rough edges and made it like really nice and smooth. And with a rock tumbler, what you're doing is kind of speeding up that process. You're kind of trying to force that process to happen by all these rocks smashing into each other as the barrel goes around and around and around. Rock tumblers are noisy and they take a long time. And it's not just like, well, they start off noisy but then they get quieter. No, they're just noisy. Like the entire time those rocks are in there. And the amount of time that it takes to turn like a regular unpolished rock into a polished one is anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks. When I think about myself as a parent and how I feel about loud toys, and then I try to imagine like banging and crashing coming from my boys' room for 2 weeks straight, I understand why I never got that rock tumbler I was hoping to have. Well, it's Labor Day weekend, and generally speaking, this weekend is a little bit of a transition time, you know, from the more kind of laid back, chill days of summer into the regular routine of fall. We go back to school, back to church, all those sorts of regular parts of our lives. And sometimes people kind of treat Labor Day weekend as summer's last hurrah. You know, one more barbecue with friends, one more weekend up at the cottage. But then sometimes we also treat it, like the start of something new. I would often spend Labor Day Monday very carefully packing my backpack and deciding what I was going to wear on the first day of school. This is not a normal fall. So this year it's fall again, and class is resuming over the next few weeks for lots of teachers and students across Ontario. But what we are facing in fall 2020 is nothing like the predictable rhythms that we've come to expect. In our family, as part of our bedtime routine, we often will do bedtime prayers with our boys. And sometimes we'll ask them, like, if they have a prayer request, what would they like us to pray for? And lately, and by lately I mean like over the past, 6 months that we've been off of school, they have been saying, the world, just pray for the world. And yeah, that's lots of grown-ups are certainly praying for the world right now too. I know that was on the prayer list that came out from the prayer team this week. The world right now is really hurting. We are sick as a whole globe, as a whole human race, and we're not only sick with COVID. We're also sick with racial hatred and bigotry. We're also sick with this highly polarized political landscape. And no, that's not just an American problem. We definitely have that kind of polarization here in Canada too. So put all those things together and add a few months of lockdown, isolation, mental health crises, and financial uncertainty, not to mention the ability of everyone with an internet connection to voice their opinions loudly and adamantly on the internet. Throw all of that together and mix it up, and here's what you get. A rock tumbler. As we prepare for a fall unlike any other, at the end of a year unlike any other, I can't help but think that the world these days is a little bit like living inside a giant global rock tumbler. And life in a rock tumbler is loud. And life in a rock tumbler is painful. And life in a rock tumbler is relentless as it just keeps going and going and going. Parents are free to say no to getting a kid like me a rock tumbler for her birthday. But you and I and all the other peoples of the earth have no choice whatsoever about the rock tumbler we find ourselves living in right now. So what do? How do we follow Jesus in a rock tumbler? Well, that's what I'd like us to talk about a little bit this morning and reflect on a little bit. Actually, I'd like to suggest that there are two different rock tumblers that we are all living in simultaneously all the time. First, there's maybe the more obvious one, is the rock tumbler of the public sphere. At the grocery store, where we work or live or go to school, maybe in those online spaces that we frequent. That's rock tumbler number one, where we're constantly banging and crashing against others who are different, have different opinions and views and ways of being. But at the same time, we don't necessarily have relationships with these people. Now, the second rock tumbler might not be quite so obvious, but is possibly even louder and even more painful than the first rock tumbler. At least it has that sort of potential. The second rock tumbler is where we have our committed covenant relationships, in our faith communities, in our families, in our lifelong friends. These are the kinds of relationships where the stakes are high and we're heavily invested and the cost is steep. In this second rock tumbler, there's a lot to gain from these more intense sorts of relationship, but there's also a lot to lose as well. For either one of these two rock tumblers, the Apostle Paul has some good words in his letter to the Colossians. So I'd like to read them for you, and then we'll kind of meditate a little bit on how we might apply what he says here, both to both of the rock tumblers, to society in general, and then to our covenant relationships. So our passage today comes from Colossians 3:12-14. You might have heard this passage read before at weddings. It's a common one there. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other, and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. The rock tumbler of the world. Let's start there. When it comes to life in the rock tumbler of the world, our interactions with people, outside of our bubbles, with different opinions and choices that we have absolutely zero control over, I think it's wise for us in those situations to focus on what we can control. And what we can control, at least to some extent, is our own self-understanding, our own attitude. Now, I want to differentiate a little bit between feelings or emotions and attitude. Emotions are physiological reactions that we have, like in our bodies, to events or situations, whether real or perceived. And in the same way that we might find that we automatically shiver when we get cold, or we automatically sweat when we get hot, we can't necessarily control the feelings that we experience, these fleeting kind of emotions on a day-to-day basis. But what we can control, at least many of us can control this a lot of the time, what we can control is what we do, how we act in response to how we feel. This is what I mean when I say our attitude. And it's attitude that Paul is sort of going for in his advice to the Corinthians, to the Colossians. In his instructions to the Colossian church about how people should treat one another and other people in general, Paul is kind of grounding his instructions in terms of how this church should act in who they are, in terms of their identity. And who the Colossians are, who all of God's people are, followers of Jesus across the globe, who all of us are, is God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. If you are a human being, you're loved by God, period. That's just who you are. And maybe when you're a follower of Jesus, your understanding of that is a little bit deeper and richer. When we follow Jesus, we own that that identity piece. We're loved. It's our identity, and it's not earnable or up for grabs. Walking around knowing that you're loved like that changes what's possible for you. When you know that you don't have to earn love by achieving things or looking a certain way or having a particular kind of job or being the funniest or the smartest or the most well-traveled person in any room you walk into, when you know that you are loved fully and completely for all that you are, and even in spite of all that you are not, with no strings attached, that changes everything. When you know you're loved, you're free. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Don't so many of us wish we could be more compassionate, kinder, more humble, more gentle, more patient? I do. But so often I don't act how I wish I could act because I'm too busy trying to prove something or earn something, or I get all wrapped up in my own petty concerns and self-pity. I haven't fully understood or incorporated my belovedness into my identity. To be loved by God means that God holds, maintains, and protects your value as a human being all the time. This means that all the energy you or I spend on that stuff, trying to prove we deserve to exist, all of that energy can be repurposed and poured out on others, regardless of how they may respond. When we know that we're loved by God, we are free to love others with kindness. We're free to act with kindness towards others in the world, and we can even do that for really annoying people. You know, even those people who have the kinds of views or make the kinds of choices that just we don't understand, you know, that we just internally kind of shake our heads and think like, why would you think that, or why would you act that way? Yeah. Even those people. I believe that the primary job of followers of Jesus toward others in the rock tumbler of the world is to love them. Period. Not to change their mind about something, but to love them. Now, I'm not saying like don't stand up for injustice or don't advocate for safety in our schools or our workplaces or don't try to follow public health advice or don't share the good news about Jesus. I'm not saying that. But in the rock tumbler of the world, changing other people's minds about stuff is not our main job. Our main job is to love them. And if we realize that we are loved by God already, our job of loving others becomes a lot easier than it might be otherwise. That's rock tumbler number 1, the rock tumbler of the world. But I said that we live simultaneously in 2 rock tumblers, the world at large and our close relationships. The second rock tumbler, where we crash and bang up against each other in uncomfortable ways, is these closer, committed relationships such as church or committed friendships or in our families or in our marriages. These are the people with whom we share a certain amount of mutual commitment. If it's a formal commitment like a marriage or a family or being a member of a church, then we might even call it a covenant. Now, the word covenant kind of sounds like fancy church speak, but it is a word that comes from the Bible, but it really just means a legal binding agreement between two parties. Its source in the Bible, in the Old Testament, God makes a covenant with Abraham. And he also later makes a covenant with David. When two people get married, they make a covenant between themselves that says, we are in this together, no matter what. And in marriage, that arrangement is legally binding. So in your marriage, you can leave. Of course, you can leave. But the covenant is not dissolved until you get a lawyer and sign a lot of paperwork and take it before a judge. Now, what makes life in this rock tumbler, the covenant or committed relationship rock tumbler, different and often harder than the rock tumbler of the world is because these relationships are binding. You know, there are a lot of annoying people out there in the world, including us. You and I are probably pretty insufferable to somebody somewhere. But here's the thing. When we find an annoying person on social media whose opinions just drive us crazy, we can just click unfollow, right? If there's an annoying or a mean person at work or at school, that's harder, to simply ignore. We can't just unfollow them. But at the very least, we can avoid them. We can go home at the end of the day, and they won't be there. If it's a really terrible boss, then maybe we want to look for another job. In other words, in the first rock tumbler, leaving, while it's not always possible or not always easy, I think it's at least a little easier, maybe. But not with covenants. Sometimes as a pastor, I get to officiate weddings. And that's a fun part of my work. But here's a kind of a quirky, funny thing I've noticed about all the weddings that I've officiated. So a lot of the time, the couples that I work with tend to be non-religious people that are maybe connected to me in some way. Maybe they know my parents or are friends of the family or find me in some other way. And they often tell me when we sit down and start crafting a service together that they're not very traditional. So we ask those questions so we can sort of form something that feels authentic for them. And they usually say to me something like, well, we're not really that traditional, which is fine. We try to work with that. But when it comes time to write their vows, usually what I'll do is I'll send them a Google Doc with a few samples, or I'll invite them to write their own if they'd like to do that. And even though these couples, say that they're not very traditional, in almost every wedding I've ever officiated includes some variation of like the traditional thing that wedding ceremonies are known for. They almost every single one has included some variation of these lines. I, Erin, take you, Dave, to be my husband, to have and to hold, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as we both shall live. That's covenant. And that's probably why even these non-traditional couples really want this piece included in their wedding ceremonies. This commitment that no matter how bad things get, we are going to be on each other's side no matter what. We are in this for the long haul. And you know, those words sound beautiful and they make people cry at wedding ceremonies, but they're really, really, really hard to live day in and day out. And they're really especially hard when you get to the for worse, for poorer, in sickness stuff. Whether it's a marriage or a committed friendship or a church community, being bound together in covenant can make all that banging and crashing inside the rock tumbler even more difficult to tolerate. And here's where Paul's words in 3:13 can kind of come in handy. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. We all have our rough edges, every single one of us. And in the rock tumbler of covenant relationships with a spouse, with a committed friendship, with children, or in a church community, we are going to bang up against each other in all sorts of uncomfortable ways. Forgiveness is the only way that can work. Now, I'm not talking about staying in an abusive relationship in any of these contexts. When there's danger involved or abuse involved, that's a different story entirely than what I'm talking about. That's a breach of covenant. What I'm talking about is normal and irritating relationships with normal but irritating people. And in those sorts of covenants, forgiveness is the only way forward. Two broken, messed up people in a covenant together as friends or in a family are going to annoy each other. A whole bunch of broken, messed up people in covenant together as a church are definitely going to annoy each other and disagree strongly with each other and probably hurt each other too. And what makes hurt in churches, I think, that much more painful is that when we disagree with each other, it's not about like who forgot to change the toilet paper roll. Well, sometimes it is, but not only about that. It's about God. It's about what we think God wants or commands and how we're going to live that out. So emotions run high, things get charged, and hurting each other is like almost a given. Now, hopefully we pay attention and we learn from our mistakes, so over time we begin to hurt each other a little bit less often, but it's still going to happen. Forgiveness is the only way forward. And if we have an active relationship with Jesus, then we also have the capacity to forgive our covenant friends. And we can do that because Jesus has forgiven us already. Where would we be if Jesus hadn't made forgiveness possible for us? lost. But here's the good news. If we're willing to put up with the slow, long grind of covenant relationships. You know, in my rock collecting days, I learned that not all polished rocks are created equal. I had some that were like my special ones, you know. If you take an ordinary gray stone from your driveway and put it in a rock tumbler, what you're going to get at the end of that possibly 2-week long process is just a smoother, glossier driveway stone. It'll feel nice and it will be smooth, and those definitely have their uses. But if you put an amethyst inside, the results are going to be very different. With an amethyst, what you get at the end of this whole process is this gorgeous, vibrant purple gemstone. When we learn to forgive one another as God has forgiven us, the rock tumbler of covenant has the power to transform us into something beautiful. This is an impossible fall in the last quarter of an impossible year. Our world is sick in more ways than one, and we are trying to navigate 1,000 impossible questions and impossible choices that we have to make. How are we going to see our parents or our grandparents if they're elderly or sick? How are we going to educate our children? How are we going to educate ourselves in this ongoing sea of racial tension? How are we going to stay connected to our friends or our church? How are we going to find a job? How are we going to keep a job? How are we going to have a baby and bring that baby into this mess? There are as many different answers to those questions as there are people. Welcome to the rock tumbler. So this Labor Day, as we bang and crash against people in the world about school opening, about masks, about politics, let's clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience in the public sphere. Let's remember our identity as dearly loved, and let's allow that knowledge to change the energy behind how we live in the world among others with different views and opinions. And in our covenant relationships, let's bear with one another and offer forgiveness to one another, knowing that Jesus has already done that for us. In other words, let's invite the Holy Spirit to be that polish or that gloss that guides the whole process, so that all this banging and crashing isn't only banging and crashing, although it is that, but that it also becomes part of our own becoming. Part of how we are conformed to the image of Christ, changing us from what we are now into something else, into something